The night everything nearly came crashing down didn't begin with thunder or fire, but with a sound that sliced through the silence like a blade. A single alarm, sharp, piercing. My mother's oxygen concentrator screamed into the darkness, like a wounded siren, its screen glowing red, low power. My stomach dropped. That machine was her lifeline, the only thing keeping her lungs moving when they no longer could. I bolted toward the generator, the one I had installed for this exact nightmare, only to stop dead in my tracks. There it was, covered in a neon sticker, the kind you'd expect on a car parked in the wrong zone. Bold black letters, violation. And worse, the wires had been cut, snipped clean by hands that cared more about rules than human breath. Through the thin walls of our house, I could almost hear her voice already, Karen Whitmore, queen of the HOA, whispering smugly in the dark. If you can't follow the bylaws, maybe your mother doesn't belong here. My fists clenched so hard I felt the bones ache. On the concentrator screen, the battery backup ticked down in angry red digits, seconds bleeding away. I wasn't just trying to save my mother's breath. I was standing in the ring against an HOA president so drunk on power, she believed her rules were heavier than life itself. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that her cruelty had already set wheels in motion. Because that night, the calm sky above our tidy cul-de-sacs would not stay calm for long. Soon it would roar with thunder not from clouds, but from blades. Black Hawk helicopters would descend on our perfect, polished neighborhood like angels of retribution. But before I take you into that storm, drop a comment with your location and the time you're watching this. I want to know where my neighbors are tuning in from around the world. When I first brought my mother Ruth to live with me by the lake, I thought I was giving her peace. For years she had fought pulmonary fibrosis, her lungs stiff as paper, her body leaning on machines to do the work her chest could no longer manage. I pictured the lake house as sanctuary, quiet waters glistening in sunlight, pines swaying in, slow rhythm, sunsets painting the sky in gold and rose. Instead, it became a cage, polished, pretty, but a cage all the same, with Karen Whitmore holding the keys like a prison warden. Karen wasn't simply an HOA president. No, she was the HOA. She wore her power-like armor, suits at block parties, clipboards at sunrise, and at her side her shadow, Brett Nolan. Brett strutted through the neighborhood in his HOA polo like it was a sheriff's badge, snapping pictures of fences, trash cans, and garden tools as though he were solving crimes. To them, my mother's oxygen concentrator wasn't a lifeline, it was unsightly. My generator wasn't safety, it was a noise hazard. The very tools that kept her alive were rebranded as violations. I still remember the first letter. Crisp, white paper, cold black font. Slid into an envelope that carried all the weight of government doom. Notice of violation, unauthorized exterior equipment. They claimed my generator ruined the uniform look of the neighborhood. I almost laughed. This wasn't a garden gnome or a windmill. This was survival. But the letters multiplied. 1 became 3. 3 became a stack. Each one stamped with fines that piled up like bricks, heavy enough to crush. My mother, bless her spirit, tried to lighten the mood. She always had that gentle humor that even nurses admired. "Maybe they're jealous," she whispered one night, tugging at the oxygen tube looped around her lap like ivy. "Not everyone can pull off the sci-fi look." She smiled, but her eyes were tired, shadows pooling beneath them. Each new fine was another weight dragging her down, another knot in my chest. That's when Maya Tran stepped into our lives. Maya, 3 houses down, an ER nurse who carried herself with the calm of someone who had stared into chaos and survived. One morning, after a long night shift still in scrubs, she knocked on our door to check on Mom. I showed her the violation. Letters. She shook her head, muttered, "Unbelievable. You need a safety plan, documentation." So I started a binder. Every notice, every email, every doctor's letter tucked inside with dates and highlights. My office transformed into a war room, stacks of statutes, ADA guidelines circled, fair housing laws marked in yellow. I filed formal requests for accommodation, supported with medical notes signed by specialists. And each time, Karen's board responded with the same frozen words. Denied. Non-compliance with community standards. At first, I tried diplomacy. I sat through board meetings under buzzing fluorescent lights, listening as Karen outlined plans for a new fence by the pool. When it was my turn, I spoke calmly, explained my mother's condition, quoted the ADA word for word. Karen leaned forward, her helmet of lacquered hair shining under the lights, and delivered her line with syrupy precision. We sympathize, but rules are rules. If we make exceptions for you, we open the floodgates. The room murmured. A cough echoed in the back. Brett scribbled something on his clipboard, smirking. I wanted to slam my fist into the table, to shout that this wasn't about lawn ornaments, this was about breath, about whether my mother would see another sunrise. Instead, I swallowed my rage and kept my voice level. But inside, something boiled, something sharp and dangerous, waiting for its moment to explode. By midsummer, the so-called courtesy notices began. They threatened to cut off community services if I didn't remove the generator. One notice even dared to call my mother's concentrator unauthorized medical equipment visible from common areas. Unauthorized, as though breathing itself was a privilege granted by Karen's board. The stress gnawed at Mom. Her oxygen dipped each time the grid flickered, which was often. I reinforced the house with battery backups, labeled every tank, laminated, physician notes to post for EMS. Still, Karen's board waved it all aside as insufficient. One evening, as the sun bled red across the lake, I stood in the yard while Brett lifted his camera to our window. The flash bounced off Mom's oxygen tube where it lay across her chair. My hands shook with the urge to smash his camera, but instead I lifted my phone and filmed him back. "Two can play this game," I muttered. The tension in the neighborhood thickened. Whispers floated across hedges. Some neighbors sympathized, others looked away, afraid of crossing Karen. The HOA group chat buzzed. Was my generator truly disruptive? Did oxygen machines count as clutter? It became absurd theater, with Karen as its star performer. Then came the wildfire drill. The county scheduled it as an annual emergency exercise, a way to test routes, shelters, power safety. I volunteered to brief neighbors, how to keep medical devices running, how to prepare when the grid failed. I knew this stuff by heart. I had taught it long before Mom's illness, but Karen called it fear-mongering. She blasted a mass email warning that unauthorized meetings would lead to fines. That was the moment I understood. Karen wasn't simply stubborn. She was dangerous. That night I looked at Mom, fragile and pale, tubing curled across her lap. Each breath was a fragile truce her body made with the world, and I promised her, silently, fiercely, that no smug tyrant, no self-crowned HOA queen, would take her air away. I didn't yet know how far Karen would go, but I knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't just coming, it had already begun. "Daniel, if we bend the rules for you, where does it stop? Someone else will want neon posters. For allergies or banners for their dietary needs. We have to be consistent." The absurdity almost broke me. Allergies, dietary needs. My mother's lungs were collapsing, and Karen wanted consistency. I glanced around the room. Some neighbors wouldn't meet my eyes, others shifted uncomfortably. There were murmurs, but Karen kept her grip on the gavel, pounding the table for silence. Brett leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smug as if he'd already won. Still, cracks were forming. Noticed one woman in the back, Mrs. Patel, whose husband, relied on dialysis, leaning forward, frowning at Karen's ords. A young father whispered to his wife, shaking his head. They might not have spoken up, but seeds had been planted. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't done. They escalated from letters to courtesy visits. Brett showed up with a clipboard and a measuring, tape crouching by the generator to photograph the clearance. Another day, I caught him scribbling notes about the extension cord running from the garage. When I challenged him, he claimed it was an unauthorized modification of the exterior facade. Exterior facade, I repeated, incredulous. It's a power cord. Community integrity, Brett barked. That's what this neighborhood is about. Integrity. That word burned like acid. I started documenting everything, not just their letters, but their behavior. I set up cameras facing the yard, kept voice recorders handy, logged every interaction with timestamps. When Brett lurked near the window one morning, I filmed him. His reflection caught perfectly in the glass as he snapped photos of my mother's tubing. "Smile for the camera," I said through the door. He scowled and stalked away, but I knew the footage was gold. Then came the wildfire drill. The county had scheduled it for months. Sirens, evacuation routes, even National Guard choppers doing practice runs over the ridge. As a search instructor, I volunteered to run a briefing for neighbors. I handed out flyers, showed people how to check backup power, explained how EMS needed unobstructed access through our gated community. It should have been common sense, but Karen stormed into my session midway high heels, clicking like gunfire on the pavement. She raised her voice over mine. "This is unauthorized fear-mongering. Daniel Hale does not represent the HOA." I turned microphone in hand and calmly said, "I don't represent the HOA. I represent the county's community emergency response team. If you have a problem, call the fire marshal." Her face flushed crimson. The crowd of neighbors glanced between us, some whispering, some smirking. Karen was rattled, and I knew it, but she doubled down. That night, an email hit every resident's inbox. "Unauthorized emergency meetings will not be tolerated. Do not be misled by individuals exaggerating risks." I nearly laughed myself sick. Exaggerating risks. This from the woman who threatened to find someone for leaving a pink flamingo in their yard overnight. But beneath the humor, there was danger. Karen's latest courtesy notice arrived the next morning. This one chilling in its precision. Failure to remove unauthorized power equipment may result in disconnection of services pending compliance. It was no longer an empty threat. They weren't just talking fines, they were threatening power. I stared at the notice, heart pounding. My mind ran the numbers. How long Mom's concentrator would last on battery, how quickly her portable tanks would run dry, how far the nearest hospital was, if an ambulance even made it past the gate. That was the moment it hit me. Karen wasn't bluffing. She was escalating. She'd built her empire on petty power plays, and now she was ready to weaponize electricity itself. And if she dared to flip that switch, she wouldn't just be violating bylaws. She'd be gambling with my mother's life. The pressure was unbearable. I felt it every time the lights flickered, every time Brett's camera flashed, every time my mother's breath rasped in the quiet of the house. We were living in a neighborhood where compassion was outlawed and cruelty was codified in print. I began to wonder how far would Karen go to prove she was queen of this little kingdom, and what would it take to finally break her throne? I didn't have to wonder for long, because Karen was about to cross a line she could never uncross. It happened on a Sunday evening, just as the cicadas started their nightly chorus and the lake reflected streaks of molten orange. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when the lights flickered once, twice, then snapped off. For a moment, I thought it was just another rolling blackout, the kind our grid seemed to cough up whenever the summer heat pressed too hard. But then I heard the shrill alarm from the living room, Mom's concentrator. I dropped the knife and sprinted down the hall. The machine's screen blinked red, power disconnected, the backup battery wind kicking in its countdown clock flashing like a bomb timer in a bad action film. I glanced at the wall outlet dead. Every other socket in the room was lifeless. Panic and fury hit me at the same time. I rushed to the garage. The generator sat in the corner, silent a fresh violation. Remove immediately sticker plastered across it. But that wasn't what stopped me cold. The power sub panel on the wall had been tampered with, the main breaker for our unit flipped down, and a note taped over it in neat block letters, pending compliance. HOA Brett. I could see his thick handwriting, smug and blocky. I slammed the breaker up, but nothing happened. My jaw clenched as I realized No. He had locked the panel shut with Apid lock. I stormed outside, fists shaking, phone already. Recording. Across the lawn, there he was, Brett polo shirt, untucked, clipboard in hand. And beside him, Karen, arms folded like a queen, surveying her conquered kingdom. "You cut my power," I shouted, camera pointed straight at them. Karen's smile was sugar and venom. "Daniel, please, we're simply enforced compliance. Unauthorized modifications to the electrical system can't be tolerated. Liability, you understand? My mother is on oxygen," I roared. "You knew this. You signed the accommodation request denial yourself." Brett shrugged. "Rules are rules." My voice shook with rage. "This is criminal obstruction. You've endangered her life." Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "If you'd simply removed the non-compliant equipment when asked, this wouldn't have happened." I wanted to leap across the grass and tear that smirk from her face. Instead, I held the phone steady. Every second of this was evidence. Behind me, the concentrator alarm screamed louder. Mom's fragile breaths were thinning, uneven. My stomach twisted. I didn't have time for theatrics. I spun and dialed 911. My voice cracked as I explained the situation. Power cut. Oxygen-dependent patient backup failing. The dispatcher stone shifted immediately from routine to urgent. "Stay on the line, sir. Paramedics are en route. Can you move your mother outside?" I glanced toward the gated entrance, remembered the stories of ambulances delayed at the keypad guards demanding proof of residency. "My blood ran cold number. They won't get in. The HOA controls the gate." The dispatcher hesitated then. "Copy. Contacting County Emergency Operations Center. My training kicked in. Years as a search instructor, teaching people to prepare for disasters, were suddenly the only thing holding me together. I barked into the phone escalate. "Request medevac. National Guards running wildfire drills nearby. Patch me through." The dispatcher complied. Within minutes, I was speaking to the county EOC. I laid it out fast. Critical oxygen-dependent patient. Power deliberately cut. Gate restricted. EMS access obstructed. Immediate airlift required. Silence. Then a clipped voice. "Copy that. Hail. We've got guard birds already airborne for the drill. Diverting now." I turned back to Karen. She was still, standing there smug in her certainty that the HOA had triumphed. "This is documented." I told her, voice steady now, iron in my tone. "You didn't just break rules, you broke the law. You cut off life support." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. Brett shifted uneasily, as if realizing for the first time that this wasn't just another petty victory. Minutes stretched like hours. I hustled back inside, hoisting Mom gently into her wheelchair, dragging the portable tank along. The battery backup blinked its final bars. Sweat poured down my temples as I wheeled her onto the porch. Then I heard it, a low thrum building. In the distance, the unmistakable chop of rotor blades. The sound swelled, rolling over the neighborhood like thunder. Windows rattled, dogs barked. People spilled from their houses, phones raised to the sky. The first Blackhawk descended over the HOA's pristine clubhouse, its floodlights slicing the night. Another hovered above the cul-de-sac rotor wash, blasting Karen's perfect flower beds flat. Soldiers and fatigues leapt out, establishing a perimeter with the precision of a well-oiled machine. I felt tears prick my eyes, not from fear, but from sheer gut-punching relief. Help had come, and it had come in force. Karen staggered backward, hair whipping in the rotor wash, screaming, "This is private property. You can't land here." A medic jogged up to me, kneeling at my mother's side with calm efficiency. Sergeant Alvarez, National Guard. He barked over the roar. "We've got her, sir. You did the right thing calling it in." Behind him, Fire Marshal Ortiz stepped off the chopper radio, crackling. His eyes swept the clubhouse, then landed on Karen. His voice was like a hammer who authorized cutting power to a medical patient. Karen sputtered, pointing at Brett. Brett stammered, pointing back at her. And all around us, neighbors watched with wide eyes, cameras recording HOA group chats blowing up with photos of Blackhawks parked on manicured grass. The HOA's illusion of control was cracking apart, shredded by the roar of rotor blades. I glanced at Karen one last time. She looked small now, her clipboard kingdom collapsing under the weight of real authority. What she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The moment those Blackhawks touched down, our neighborhood's illusion of order shattered like glass under a hammer. For years, Karen's word had been law, bylaws, fines, courtesy notices delivered with a venom-laced smile. But the second rotor wash flattened her prized bonus. Her reign ended. The medics worked fast. Sergeant Alvarez and his crew moved my mother with surgical precision. Their voices clipped but calm over the chaos. They transferred her to a stretcher fitted with portable oxygen, checking vitals and sliding her into the belly of the chopper, where equipment hummed with reliability Karen could never comprehend. I hovered close, fighting the urge to collapse with relief. For the first time in months, my mother was safe, safer in the hands of combat medics than in her own home under the HOA. Floodlights swept across the manicured lawn. Fire Marshal Ortiz barked orders into his radio, designating the HOA's precious clubhouse as an incident command post. Deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape. Soldiers secured the perimeter, their boots chewing up Karen's perfectly edged grass. The sound was beautiful, a new order imposed over Karen's tyranny. Karen herself was a sight to behold. Her arms flailed as she screeched, "You can't be here! This is private property. I'm the HOA president. I demand you leave immediately." Ortiz turned his reflective vest, glowing in the floodlights. He looked at her the way a surgeon looks at a tumor, clinical detached. "Ma'am, under state emergency. Statutes. Your authority is suspended. You obstructed EMS access and tampered with critical infrastructure. Step aside." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She pointed at me, voice cracking. "He exaggerates. He's been manipulating everyone." But Ortiz had already spotted the note taped over my breaker box, Brett's signature scrawl glaring in black ink. He ripped it down, held it up under the floodlight, and said, "Who wrote this?" Brett tried to melt into the background, but the deputies flanked him. One tapped his body cam. "We've got footage of you at the sub-panel, sir." "You want to explain?" Brett stammered. Karen told me it was just a temporary disconnection. Karen shrieked, "Don't you dare put this on me, Brett. I filmed everything from me porch." The lens caught Karen's fury. Brett's sweat, the soldiers calmly moving through the chaos. Evidence, receipts, proof that this wasn't paranoia, it was criminal negligence. Neighbors spilled out of their homes in clusters, pajamas flapping, and the rotor wash phones raised high. The HOA group chat pinged nonstop. Is this real? Why are there helicopters? Did Karen really cut his power? Screenshots and shaky videos flew across social media faster than the choppers could spin. I caught sight of Maya, my ER nurse neighbor, pushing through the crowd. Her hair was windblown, her eyes fierce. She clapped a hand on my shoulder and shouted over the roar, "She's stable. They've got her oxygen regulated. You did the right thing." For the first time in hours, my lungs remembered how to expand. Relief warred with a new fury bubbling inside me. Because as grateful as I was for the medics, I couldn't ignore the truth. This didn't need to happen. My mother didn't need helicopters and floodlights. All she needed was compassion. And Karen had strangled that out of the neighborhood long ago. The deputies pressed Karen and Brett against the clubhouse wall, not in cuffs yet, but under the bright gaze of every phone camera in the cul-de-sac. Ortiz asked pointed questions: who authorized Thelock on the sub-panel, who ordered the power cut, who ignored ADA accommodation requests. Each question was a nail in the coffin of their authority. Karen tried to spin it. We were protecting the community from liability. His equipment was unsightly dangerous. Even dangerous, I barked, unable to hold back. The only danger here is you. You cut power to a life support machine. You left my mother to suffocate because you didn't like HOA generator look next to your rose bushes. The crowd murmured, neighbors exchanging glances. Some nodded, others whispered, but the tide had turned. Karen's veneer of control had cracked, and behind it, people saw her cruelty naked and raw. The soldiers ignored her entirely. To them, she was background noise less significant than a gust of dust. They had a patient to save, and that patient was already being loaded for transport. Then Ortiz made the call that sealed her fate. We're impounding the HOA clubhouse until further notice. Evidence collection. Karen's scream could have cracked glass. You can't. That's our property. The dues, the insurance, but no one listened. Deputies rolled crime scene tape across the front doors. Soldiers stacked gear inside. The clubhouse once. Karen's throne room was now a command post under state control. I turned my camera back on myself. Voice, steady eyes, hard. Let the record show. I said that tonight when an HOA president thought she was above the law came down from the sky. Karen lunged at me, but a deputy stepped between us. She was seething hair, wild mascara streaking down her face. For the first time, she wasn't queen of the neighborhood. She was just another defendant waiting for charges. As the second chopper lifted off, carrying my mother safely toward the hospital, the crowd broke into scattered applause. Not for me, not even for the medics, but for the simple, undeniable fact that Karen had finally lost. The night air smelled of jet fuel and crushed flowers. The floodlights faded as soldiers packed up equipment. Their job done. But mine was just beginning because I knew Karen would fight back with lawyers and lies clawing at every technicality she could. That was fine. I was ready. I had footage, documents, witnesses, and a neighborhood that had just seen with their own eyes who Karen truly was. She thought cutting off my mother's oxygen would bend me into compliance. Instead, it summoned Blackhawks to her doorstep and spotlighted her corruption for the world to see. And this was only the prelude. When the soldiers finally lifted off, the neighborhood was left in eerie silence, broken only by the buzzing of 100 text notifications. Karen's kingdom lay in ruins. The clubhouse wrapped in yellow tape. Brett sweating bullets under deputy. Questions and neighbors whispering like kids who had just witnessed the principal being marched out in handcuffs. I should have felt triumphant. My mother was safe at the hospital, stabilized under the care of professionals who didn't treat her. Life like an aesthetic inconvenience. But triumph wasn't what I felt. What I felt was focus, because now, with the HOA stripped bare under the rotor wash, I had the leverage to finish what Karen had started. First step, gather receipts. I spent the next 2 days in my office binder. Open laptop, glowing cameras humming. Every violation notice Karen had ever sent, scanned. Every email denying reasonable accommodation uploaded. Every time-stamped video of Brett lurking with his camera cataloged. I built a timeline so clean and precise it could have been taught in law school. From the first unsightly equipment letter to the night Karen personally signed the order, isolating my power. Maya stopped by with coffee, dropping her ER badge on the desk as she leaned over my shoulder. "You're building a case file, aren't you?" "Not just a case," I said, flipping to a tab marked Statutes. A hammer, she smirked. Remind me never to get on your bad side. The hammer grew heavier with each document. I filed formal complaints with the County ADA Office, the Fair Housing Department, and the State Attorney General. Maya added her clinical notes, confirming Mom's oxygen dependency and the risk of even brief interruptions. It wasn't just my word against Karen's anymore. It was medical fact, documented, and undeniable. But paper trails alone don't topple tyrants. For that, you need people. So I turned to the neighbors. At first they were hesitant, burned too many times by Karen's intimidation tactics. But the helicopter spectacle had shifted something. People who'd stayed silent now found their voices. Mrs. Patel told me how Karen once threatened fines when her husband's dialysis supplies were delivered outside approved hours. A young couple admitted Karen had blocked their ramp request because it interfered with the visual flow of the street. One after another, stories poured in. I listened, documented, and then with a calm smile, slid proxy forms across the table. If you're tired of living under a tyrant sign here, there's a special election, clause in the bylaws. We only need 51% to trigger a recall. The irony was delicious. The same bylaws Karen worshipped would become the guillotine blade. Maya helped me host quiet gatherings in living rooms and backyards away from Brett's camera lens. We shared stories, compared violation letters, laughed at the absurdity of someone measuring grass height with a ruler. The laughter turned into resolve. Within a week, my stack of proxies was thick enough to choke a shredder. Meanwhile, Karen tried to salvage her image. She sent out glossy mailers. Yes, actual mailers claiming the helicopter incident was a gross misunderstanding orchestrated by a disgruntled resident. She accused me of exploiting emergency services for personal drama, but the internet never forgets. Videos of her screaming private property at soldiers had gone viral. Comment sections roasted her harder than any courtroom could. Memes popped up overnight. Karen with helicopter rotors photoshopped into her hair. Brett in a mall cop uniform holding caution tape. The HOA board's credibility was shredded by pixels before any judge touched the case. Still, I wasn't reckless. Karen had money connections and the kind of entitlement that made her believe she could outspend justice. So, I doubled down. I filed discovery requests through my attorney, forcing the board to hand over emails and internal memos. And oh, the gems we found. One thread in particular sealed their fate. Brett writing, "If we cut his power, he'll cave. No way he can risk mommy running out of air." Karen's reply, "Do it. He needs to learn the HOA runs this neighborhood, not his sob stories." I almost pied them. Almost. Because when I presented that email chain at the recall planning meeting, the room gasped as if they'd witnessed a car crash. "This isn't just negligence," I said, my voice steady. "It's malice." Maya leaned forward, speaking for the first time. "And it's criminal. I'll testify." The momentum was unstoppable now. Neighbors once paralyzed by fear were suddenly energized, scribbling names on recall petitions, whispering strategies. Even those who defended Karen before looked pale, realizing they'd hitched their wagon to a sinking ship. Karen tried to fight back the only way she knew how: theatrics. She staged a community unity barbecue plastering posters about healing divisions and focusing on the future. But the turnout was pathetic. Half a dozen loyalists sipping flat soda while the rest of the neighborhood gathered in my backyard, signing proxies and swapping stories of her abuses. I stood before them with the binder. Pages fanned like wings. We're not just taking her down. When I told them, we're rewriting what this neighborhood stands for. Compassion, safety, dignity, not fear. For the first time since moving Mom in, I felt something stronger than rage. I felt solidarity. These people weren't just my neighbors anymore. They were allies. And together we were about to make Karen face a reckoning she couldn't bully, fine, or threaten her way out of. The recall election date was set. The proxy stacked high. The legal hammer was cocked. Karen thought she could cut my mother's oxygen and leave us powerless. Instead, she'd handed Meetha one thing. She feared most a united community armed with the truth. And soon, every spotlight, every camera, every vote would be pointed straight at her. The night of the special recall meeting felt like the Super Bowl of suburban politics. The HOA clubhouse, once Karen's throne room, was packed so tight, people had to stand along the back wall. Folding chairs scraped against tile floors. The smell of burnt coffee lingered from the lobby urn, and a low buzz of anticipation rippled through the air. For years, neighbors had whispered about Karen in driveways and cul-de-sacs, but tonight the whispers became a roar. I arrived with my binder tucked under one arm, a portable projector in the other. Maya walked beside me, carrying a stack of witness statements like ammunition. Even Fire Marshal Ortiz was there in uniform, seated near the front arms, crossed a living reminder that Karen's authority had already been trumped by real law. Karen, of course, had dressed for battle blazer, sharp enough to cut glass pearls glinting under fluorescent lights, hair lacquered into immovable perfection. Brett lurked at her side, eyes darting like a cornered animal. She opened the meeting with her usual pomp gavel cracking against the table. "This session is called to order," she declared, voice trembling only slightly. "We're here to address baseless accusations and restore confidence in our leadership." The murmurs from the crowd said otherwise. When my turn came, I rose slowly, clicking on the projector. The screen lit up with the first exhibit, a timeline stretching across weeks, each violation notice lined up like dominoes. Gasps followed as I flipped through evidence, emails, photos, videos. "This," I said, voice steady, "isn't about aesthetics, it isn't about rules. It's about cruelty codified into policy." The footage rolled Brett cutting across my yard, snapping photosoft oxygen tubing. Karen in a board meeting waving my laminated emergency signs like contraband. A freeze frame of the breaker box padlocked shut with pending compliance. HOA scrolled across it. The room shifted uneasily. I felt the weight of eyes, some widening in shock, others narrowing in anger, not at me, but at the leaders who had humiliated them all for years. Then I played the clip that broke the dam, Karen's voice sharp and unmistakable, ordering bread. "Make it hurt." So he complies, gasps. A woman in the back covered her mouth. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Karen shot to her feet, screeching, "That's taken out of context." I raised a hand, silencing her. Context. I clicked to the next slide, the email thread. Brett's typed words. "If we cut his power, he'll cave. No way he can risk Mommy running out of air." And Karen's reply, "Do it." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room burned into her, into Brett, into the empire they'd built on intimidation. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, scanning the room, "this isn't about me. It's about whether you want to live in fear of citations, fines, and retaliation, or whether you want a neighborhood built on compassion and common sense. Tonight, you decide." Maya stepped forward, then her voice calm, clinical. She read from her notes describing how oxygen deprivation can kill in minutes. How cutting power to medical equipment wasn't just negligent, it was lethal. She didn't embellish, she didn't need to. Her authority was ironclad, and the room listened, in stunned silence. Karen tried one last gambit. She slammed her hand on the table. "This is a witch hunt. He's manipulating you with soba stories. I've sacrificed for this community. Without me, the property values." "Without you," Mrs. Patel interrupted from the audience, rising to her feet. "My husband would have had his dialysis interrupted. Without you, my neighbors wouldn't live in fear of fines for Christmas lights or wheelchair ramps." Others joined in voices, growing louder, angrier. A father shouted about the time Brett threatened to find his kids for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A teenager called out that Karen made her mother cry over unauthorized garden gnomes. Every story piled atop Thelast, a mountain of grievances, finally unchained. The gavel in Karen's hand was useless against the tide. The recall vote was called. Ballots shuffled, proxies counted, hands raised high. The results weren't close. A landslide. Karen and Brett were officially removed from the board, their reign collapsing under the very rules they'd once weaponized. The applause was thunderous, shaking the walls of the clubhouse. People hugged, laughed, even cried. Years of frustration released in one cathartic eruption. Deputies stepped forward, serving Karen with notices of investigation, obstruction of emergency services, reckless endangerment, violations of fair housing law. Brett's face went pale as a sheet. Karen sputtered, still shrieking about property values even as neighbors filmed her meltdown. Then came the most powerful moment of the night. My mother, frail but determined, wheeled herself forward. The room quieted instantly. She placed trembling hands on the microphone and said softly but firmly, "Policy without compassion is cruelty. Tonight you chose compassion. Thank you." Her words landed like an arrow in every heart. Even the deputies paused, faces softening. Some neighbors wiped tears from their eyes. I looked at Karen then. For the first time, she seemed small. Her pearls, her blazer, her lacquered hair, meaningless in the face of a community that had finally seen her for what she was. The gavel passed to an interim board chosen on the spot from among volunteers. Cheers erupted again as new leaders promised transparency, fairness, and most importantly, basic humanity. I closed my binder, sliding it under my arm. The evidence had done its job. The neighbors had done theirs. Justice wasn't finished. There would be trials, hearings, restitution. But tonight, Karen's stranglehold was broken. As people filed out, into the night, I stood on the clubhouse steps, breathing in the cool air. The sky was quiet now. No rotors, no floodlights, just stars glimmering faintly above. My mother sat beside me, a soft smile on her face. "You did it," she whispered. "No," I said, glancing back at the neighbors, laughing and hugging. "We did, but deep down I knew the fight wasn't completely over. Karen was cornered, yes, but cornered animals lash out. And I had one last card to play, one last truth to reveal. The real twist was still waiting in the wings. The morning after the recall, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer, as if someone had opened a window and let out years of stale, suffocating air. The crime scene tape was gone from the clubhouse, replaced by folding tables stacked with clipboards, sign-up sheets, and donuts. Instead of Karen's dictates, there were open discussions, laughter, neighbors actually listening to each other. The interim board wasted no time. They voted unanimously to add a compassion clause to the bylaws, guaranteeing reasonable accommodations for medical needs. EMS received permanent gate access codes, and neighbors formed a volunteer team with Maya at the helm of first aid training. Watching her teach CPR on the same manicured lawn where Karen once screamed at kids for running too loudly was almost poetic. Restitution came next. All fines levied against residents for medical or accessibility needs were voided. Families were reimbursed, citations torn up in front of cheering crowds. One by one, people brought forward their stories. Christmas lights, ramps, chalk art, and each was acknowledged, apologized for, and wiped from the record. And yet, amidst the healing, Karen lingered like a storm cloud at the edge of town. She wasn't gone. Not yet. She faced investigations, court dates, maybe even jail time, but entitlement doesn't die quietly. Rumors swirled that she was hiring lawyers, crafting counterclaims, planning some grand defense. That was fine because I still had the twist she didn't know about. At the next community meeting, I stood before the crowd binder under my arm. Projector, glowing. "I want to clear something up," I began. "The night the power was cut, I didn't summon Blackhawks out of nowhere. I didn't pull strings or stage a spectacle. Whispers ran through the room. I clicked to the next slide. Photos of wildfire drill schedules, maps with evacuation routes, my own CERT credentials. I've been a county CERT instructor for years. I knew the Guard was airborne for training. When Karen cut my mother's oxygen, I didn't make a miracle happen. I simply knew exactly whom to call. Karen didn't fall to luck or theatrics. She fell to her own arrogance. Gasps, then applause rippled through the room. Neighbors looked at me, differently, not just as the son who fought for his mother, but as someone who had prepared, planned, and stood his ground when it mattered most. Karen, if she ever watched the footage, would finally understand she hadn't been toppled by chance. She'd been dismantled by inevitability. Weeks later, the Black Hawk crew returned, not for an emergency, but for a community demo. Kids climbed into the cockpit. Parents snapped photos. Maya handed out first aid kits. My mother, frail but smiling, sat beneath a canopy, watching with misty eyes as neighbors she barely knew came to shake her hand and thank her. Across the street, I spotted Karen, arms crossed, standing in the shadows of her porch. No pearls, no gavel, no power, just a woman watching the community she once ruled celebrate without her. And in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt closure because she could rage, she could plot, she could cling to her dwindling scraps of authority, but the neighborhood had chosen compassion over cruelty, and that was something she could never undo. The rotor blades thundered overhead once more, not as harbingers of fear, but as symbols of resilience. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, knowing my mother could, too. Because in this neighborhood, finally, air was free. If this story taught me anything, it's that rules without compassion are nothing more than chains. My mother's oxygen wasn't a convenience, it was her lifeline. And yet, one person's obsession with control nearly turned that lifeline into a noose. We live in a world where policy, power, and pride can collide in dangerous ways. But when people stand together armed with truth, unity, and yes, sometimes helicopter's tyranny doesn't stand a chance. What Karen forgot, and what we must all remember, is that authority is borrowed, not owned. Whether it's an HOA, a workplace, or a government office, leadership only matters if it protects the people it serves. Strip away empathy, and what's left is just cruelty with a badge. But here's the other truth. You don't need Black Hawks to make change. You need neighbors willing to speak, allies willing to act, and the courage to push back when compassion is missing. Sometimes justice arrives with rotor blades. More often, it arrives with signatures, votes, and voices refusing to be silenced. So here's my challenge to you watching this now. Think about your own community. Where are rules being used as weapons? Where could compassion change everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more stories like this, equal parts drama, satire, and hard-earned justice, hit that subscribe button because this isn't just my fight, it's ours.